hopefully ready for our afternoon session. Certainly our panel is. We had two excellent panels in the morning. We talked about prospect for Palestinian freedom. Our second panel handled sectarianism, which is rampant in the Middle East and North Africa, the Arab world. And now we come to the logical next panel, which is Palestine in the Middle. Where is the Palestinian question? Which is the most urgent and important questions regardless of what other dynamics are in the Arab world and the Middle East. I'm going to take the chairman's prerogative to say a few words. The most important conflict and question in the Middle East and probably in the universe on planet Earth is the Palestinian question. I have participated in several such panels. By the way, I'm a surgeon, so I'm not a politician. And I say that unless there is peace in the Middle East, unless there is peace and a just solution for the Palestinian question, there will be no peace in the Middle East. And there will be no peace in the world. Mark my word, for all those of you who will live long enough. Again, I mentioned I'm a doctor. So unless we handle the Palestinian question in a just manner, we will be talking about these things for a long time. But we do have a panel here to analyze where things are right now, Palestine in the Middle. The moderator will pose questions for those who have joined us late, and the panelists will kick the questions around. But let me mention just a couple of things. One, the bios of all of the panelists are in the booklet that is in your hands. And two, we have a page of acknowledgments for our donors over the last year since the last meeting. Please look at it. Look at our mission, look at our website. And if it's something that you would like to participate in, we would love to have you as a friend of the Jerusalem Fund and the Palestine Center. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it to our moderator, Mr. George Hishma, who is on the Palestine Center Committee. He is on the board of the Jerusalem Fund, and he is one of the 6 founders of the Jerusalem Fund in 1977. He's a journalist, maybe a retired journalist, but he's very active right now writing, and his bio is in the booklet. So, Mr. Hishma or George.
Thank you very much. I see all of you are awake. The lunch must not be very heavy. You ate very decently, not over much. Right. Okay. I was very impressed at the 2 panelists we have here with us. They both have extensive media background, and I have just suggested to our president and to other members of the board that we should really have a panel, a seminar on the media, how the media in the U.S. functions, why are they telling their readers our story correctly, and what is actually, more importantly, what we can do, or the Arab community in large, or even the Arab diplomatic community. We have almost 100 Arab and Muslim diplomats in America, 50 in Washington, 50 at the UN. I have yet to see an op-ed from one of them. And I want to tell you that I have, my necktie has a dragon on it. That's why I speak loudly, clearly, and I'm not afraid of saying my opinion. So read my column in the Washington Report in the Middle East. It was available out there. I want to ask the panelists one question before we. Okay, I'm sorry. Let me introduce the panelists for you. We have Osamah Khalil, He's an assistant professor of U.S. and Middle East history at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. He is a professor at the Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. He is also the founder of Al-Shabaka, a website I recommend very highly for you, the Palestinian Policy Network. He received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. He has been a frequent media commentator at such outlets as the Huffington Post, the Los Angeles Times, HuffPost Live, Al Jazeera English, and the Real News Network. Really, this is Khalil, Dr. Khalil. We also have with us Manal Jamal. She's an assistant professor of political science at James Madison University, which is close by in Virginia. She is the assistant professor of political science at James Madison University. During the late 1990s, she was based in the Palestinian territories. She worked as journalist and researcher at the Jerusalem Media and Communications Center and consulted for the United Nations Special Coordinator's Office in the occupied territories. Then Alternative Information Center, which is the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights. She currently serves as a member of the Middle East Studies Association's Committee for Academic Freedom. And this is a very important association, by the way, which includes many people who teach on the Middle East. And she's a member of the Transitional Board of Directors of the Association for Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Studies, and is completing a book manuscript titled Democracy Promotion in Troubled Times, The Limits of Western Donor Assistance to Civil Society, which examines the impact of donor assistance to civil society in the Palestinian territories and elsewhere. Give them a clap. Before we start, I'm deviating from the questions that have been prepared for me to ask. I always do that. Manal,
Yes.
are you hopeful? Are you more hopeful than last year, this year, about the Palestinian question? Just in one sentence, two sentences.
Not necessarily. No, not yet.
Not yet.
I'm not hopeful.
Oh,
Can
speak
you
in
hear
me.
Yeah. No?
Please, if you can't hear the speakers, just raise your hand and I will understand. I'll just slap them on their hand.
Volume. Come on. 1 minute. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. So I'm hopeful long term.
Speak into the mic. Yeah.
I'm hopeful, possibly hopeful long term. Not very hopeful short term.
What about you, Osamah?
Can you hear me? Or? Yeah. Okay. Let me just say a couple of things. First, I want to thank the Jerusalem Fund and the Palestine Center for having me. I'm a great admirer of the work that's done by the Jerusalem Fund. So I also want to thank Samira and for organizing, and Yusuf, and of course Dr. Subhi. And just a quick correction, I'm a co-founder of Shabaka. We have a great number of policy members and advisors. If you don't know our website, please check it out. But one of our board members, Grace Saeed, is here, and one of the co-founders. And so there are several co-founders. Much like Manal, I'm also hopeful for the long term, but very, very discouraged in the short term. And one of the things I hope that we'll discuss today, and one of the things we've tried to discuss on the Shabaka as well, is what are some things we can do in the short term to make a longer term future possible for Palestinians. And so I have a great fear that if we don't do these things, that the longer term will be far more negative. The consequences will be far more negative than they have been so far.
Thank you. For decades, Palestine has sat at the center of the Arab people's hearts and the center of their minds. Today, in a region facing many challenges from Egypt to the Levant and the Gulf, Palestine sits in the middle of a region that is more turbulent than ever. Our panel today explores the effects of regional events on the politics and future of Palestine. I'm going to ask the first question, and the panelists, you can respond as you like. Throughout the years, Palestinian factions have depended on Arab state actors for support. How has this changed in recent years? And can Palestinian strategy become less dependent? Manal, you want to start first?
I can. Palestinians have been highly dependent on state actors, and for various reasons and natural reasons. First, for safe haven, beginning. It's not okay. For safe haven, I mean, the PLO depended on Arab countries needing to be in Jordan first, Lebanon, later Tunisia. Since the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, they've also been highly dependent on state donors for obvious reasons. Hamas has been very dependent on other state actors in terms first Syria and Iran, now more so Qatar. Ideally, yes, it would be very nice if they would be less dependent. But in the reality of the situation, it's a very difficult situation, and becoming less dependent is quite complex. And I don't imagine it'll be happening anytime soon. So I'll start with that.
What about you?
Yeah, I would obviously I would agree with that. I mean, one of the things that's important to remember, and some of this, of course, predates even the Nakba in 1948, is the role that Palestine has played in a broader regional stance, but also how the different Arab governments and different Arab countries, as well as the broader, whether it was Britain, France, or the United States, and the Zionist movement itself, had attempted to influence and play a part in Palestine and Palestinian politics. But there's also a role that the Palestinians have played. And I think we can't ignore that, right? That often the Palestinians have allowed themselves to be used by different governments or offered themselves to be used by different governments. So whether it was, if we look back to the 1970s, the somewhat tacit alliance between, say, Fatah and Egypt versus the PFLP, which was taking money either sometimes from Iraq or from Libya. Fatah itself, which used to take money at times from Libya. So they often allowed themselves to be played and played that game themselves. It was easier during the heyday of the PLO, at the height of the Cold War, when there was a superpower conflict, to play this game. That has gotten much more difficult. And it's gotten much more difficult in part because of the founding of the Palestinian Authority, in the sense that the Palestinian, instead of being an international and broadly pan-Arab movement, that it has become localized. And I would argue that there's also a lot of exhaustion among some of the Arab states in continuing the support of the Palestinian movement. And part of that is a result of Oslo.
Yeah.
Okay. Too close?
Too close
is that
to
better?
the mouth,
Okay.
yeah.
So part of that is a result of Oslo. And of course, the dismantling, the obvious dismantling of the PLO, which could have been which was an international organization, but one which itself was played upon by the different Arab states deliberately sometimes, and of course, a deliberate action by either the Arab states or by the PLO factions themselves.
That's it. For a moment, I want to explain to you there's a difference that many people don't realize. We have the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, and we have the Palestinian Authority. The PLO is the political arm of the Palestinians. The ones who's doing negotiations with Israel right now is the PLO, not the Palestinian Authority. That's why Abbas has two titles. He's head of both organizations. So people who work for the PA are not necessarily members of the PLO or vice versa. Interestingly, let's look at the first question. Loudly, please. Okay. Gaza, now under the control of Hamas, has a border with an Arab Spring state, quote unquote, Egypt, and is more directly impacted by these changes than the West Bank. What real changes has taken place on the border, both during and after the Muslim Brotherhood brief rule in Egypt? How is this likely to play out in the future?
Should I start? I can start. Just in terms of background, as you may know, Hamas was operating approximately 1,200 tunnels between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. And the tunnels were used basically to bring in everything to do with Gaza's livelihood. From construction materials, from food, to more luxury items were being brought in through these tunnels. Approximately 1,200 as of 2010. By even under the Brotherhood, when Morsi was in power, they began closing down many of these tunnels, and so hundreds of these tunnels were closed down. We tend to think that the relationship between Hamas and the Brotherhood was quite rosy, and in actuality, the relationship was not as rosy as many anticipated, because in Egypt, the security apparatus, the security structure, I mean, the regime as a whole wasn't changed fundamentally. So things were okay, but they were not, you know, there wasn't this drastic improvement in relations between the Palestinians and Hamas in Egypt. More recently, however, after the removal of Morsi, things have deteriorated, and most of the tunnels have been closed. So we'll likely see this deterioration in relationships in the short term. But in the long term, once things are stabilized, and I don't know when that's going to happen in Egypt, that does bode well, not only for Hamas, not only for the Gaza Strip, I think for the Palestinians in general, in the long term, not yet. And perhaps Osamah could add to that.
Osamah, let me just explain to the audience. You know, throughout the years, the Palestinian factions have depended on Arab state actors, usually, for support. But this has changed in recent years. And should the Palestinian strategy become less dependent on Palestinian state control?
So let me answer kind of the two parts of that question. I mean, should it become less dependent on Arab state control? Yes. Will it? Not likely. And I think for some of the reasons that...
Why?
Well, in part because, as we discussed, already, you have Palestinians are a non-state actor. We have no state, right? In spite of whatever was achieved at the UN in the past year, this kind of UN observer state, observer role that they have. As a result, and part of this has been, as I mentioned before, a deliberate strategy, right? That the PLO, when it existed, it no longer exists. So I want to come back to the point you made before. The PLO, when it existed, was reliant on bigger states, right? In particular the Arab states. And in some cases, the Soviet Union, but some of the key states it relied on were Egypt and Algeria, right? To a lesser extent, Syria. And as part of that reliance, right, many of the different factions ended up getting dragged into some of those local affairs. So, for instance, the fight between Iraq and Syria, the PLO ended up playing a role in that fight. The civil war in Lebanon, the PLO ended up playing a role in that fight. Even with Egypt, and once Egypt, of course, was kicked out of the Arab League after the 78 Camp David Accords, Egypt had played a fundamental role in its involvement with the PLO and Fatah. So it is very difficult to suggest now that they should somehow develop an independent strategy when their entire strategy all along the way has been to rely on the Arab states. This has become compounded, as I was saying earlier, by the Oslo Accords, in which you have an authority that is created that is dependent on money from the United States and the European Union, tax revenues from Israel, and of course, diplomatic support from the different Arab states. It makes it very, very difficult to become an independent, viable national movement. On top of that, the PLO, when it existed, and the PA, has also relied often on Jordan, when it was King Hussein and now King Abdullah, for additional diplomatic support. And of course, they share a border with Jordan that they do not control. Right? Makes it very difficult. We see this also in Gaza. Right? For instance, it is no secret, as Manal was mentioning, the role of the Egyptian authorities in maintaining the siege of Gaza. It is not a mystery. And it was not a mystery under Mubarak. It was not a mystery that Mubarak's chief of intelligence, Omar Suleiman, was one of the key gatekeepers of the siege of Gaza. And the corruption to get into Gaza was a known secret among every single NGO that operates in Gaza, that you had to pay bribes to the Egyptian authorities to get into Gaza to do your work. More to the point, there is nobody who believes that the tunnel trade did not exist without the tacit acknowledgement of the Egyptian military, right? Yeah. And bribes that were paid to make sure that that tunnel traffic was allowed to continue. So let's be clear. Yes, the Palestinians have been forced to rely on the Arab states, but the Arab states have not often been the great supporters of the Palestinians that we would like to pretend them to be. And there are a number of reasons for that, which we can get into. But I want to come back to this point, this separation between the PLO and the Palestinian Authority. Let's be clear. The PLO was dismantled after the Oslo Accords. It no longer exists. It exists on paper. Mahmoud Abbas's title of chairman of the executive committee of the PLO is an empty title. That organization does not exist. What exists of the PLO, liberation has been pulled out of the Palestine Liberation Organization. That's gone. What we have instead is a Palestinian negotiating authority. Right? Their goal is to negotiate with the Israelis and to receive revenues from the United States in return for their participation in the peace process, as we talked about this morning. So I think we have to be very clear. The PLO no longer exists except on paper. And what we have instead is an authority that collaborates with, whether it's Israel, and to a larger extent, and to a bigger extent, even the United States and its participation in the peace process.
But in theory, it does still exist.
How?
I mean, on paper. Well, yeah.
Yeah. But
and
this
people have
this is
organization.
Let's remember, what are the key structures of the PLO? What are the key structures? The Parliament in Exile, the Palestinian National Council, has not met since 1996. And even then, that meeting, as we all know, as everybody in this room knows, that meeting was not a legitimate meeting. Okay? So it hasn't held a meeting since before the Oslo Accords. That is the key structure of the PLO. The Palestinian Executive Committee, which is the executive body governing the PLO, initially under Arafat and then under Mahmoud Abbas, all of its members have either been appointed by Arafat or Abbas. They have not been appointed through using the legal structures of the PLO. PLO no longer exists. It does not exist. And so I think we have to be really honest with ourselves as Palestinians about that fact and be honest about what the Palestinian Authority is and what it is not.
Thank you for the elaboration. I just wanted to point out that the negotiations right now between Israel and the Palestinians is at which level? The PA or the PLO?
Technical.
Yes.
So look, let's be clear. The signatory to the Oslo Accords is the Palestine Liberation Organization. Okay? However, after the accords were signed and when they were implemented in 1994, Yasser Arafat, in a very deliberate manner, dismantled the PLO. Okay? All of us
officially?
All of us who are old enough to remember.
Yeah.
Okay. All of us who are old enough to remember what the PLO was in the 1970s and 1980s can tell the difference between that and this today. Now, I've just pointed out the two key structures of the PLO. So the reason why this facade of paper called the Palestine Liberation Organization exists on paper is because they are the signatory to the Oslo Accords. The Palestinian National Authority was created to implement the accords. Okay? But all of the key funding, all of the key individuals, everything was moved from the PLO office in Tunis. That itself was dismantled, brought initially to Gaza, and then to Ramallah. Anything else that's left, for instance, Farouk Kaddoumi, still holds a title, right? Still holds a title and sits in Amman, and occasionally someone will listen to him, right? He'll hold a press conference, and occasionally someone will come pay attention to him. The PLO no longer exists. We have to be honest about that. And what does exist, the liberation aspect of the PLO, has been stripped away, right? What we have instead is a Palestinian negotiating authority. That's its goal, that's its job, and that's all that it does.
My next question. The Palestinian refugees in Syria, Manal, are once again seeking refuge from conflict. What was the official Palestinian position towards the events in Syria? And how has the presence of refugees complicated this? What if any assistance can official Palestinian entities offer Palestinian refugees in Syria?
I feel a bit uncomfortable just discussing Palestinian refugees in Syria, given the magnitude of the crisis. As of right now, we have approximately 6 million Syrians who've become refugees. In Syria alone, there are approximately 460,000 Palestinian refugees. Of those 460,000 refugees, about 65,000 have left. And most of them right now are in Lebanon. I think the number is around 42,000 last I checked. The official Palestinian position, i.e. PLO, Okay,
Yeah.
What Mahmoud Abbas said was that the Palestinians would be neutral. They would not side with either side. They're against intervention, and that he's asked Palestinians, wherever they may be in Lebanon or Syria, not to intervene. So that's the official PLO/PA position. Hamas has been a bit less clear, and so as what often happens, you hear different voices. So Mahmoud Zahar's position has been more about neutrality, whereas Haniya and Mish'al have been much more supportive of or more anti-regime, and that's one of the reasons they've had to leave. But as for the refugees, Abbas initially wanted to appeal to Ban Ki-moon to facilitate for the moving of Palestinian refugees from Syria to the Palestinian territories, namely to the West Bank. And that was his initial, request. And for this to happen, there'd have to be Israeli approval. And so my understanding is that Israel has required or requested that whoever comes waive their right of return. And because of this, Abbas has basically refused. So this is where things are at right now. In terms of what should be done, obviously all the refugees need more support, but we need to keep in mind that at this moment, UNRWA is dealing with about a $48 million deficit. So resources are already very slim. It makes sense at this point really to ask the refugees exactly what they want, and to facilitate, if possible, to facilitate their move elsewhere if the West Bank is not going to be an option. But that's what I believe should be done at this point.
Osamah, would you?
Yeah, I think I just want to add to Manal's point, which I think is very well taken. And this is a personal issue for me as well. My wife's family is split between Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. Her uncle in Syria is from the Yarmouk camp, has been living in a hotel for a year. And when he's tried to go back to his home in the Yarmouk, there are squatters there, and it's no longer his home. And so there's a lot of focus on the refugees, and rightfully so, who have fled Syria, but there's also a massive internally displaced group. Okay, this, of course, itself, and when you look at this tragedy of the Syrian refugees, is, as Manal mentioned, is part of a broader tragedy. Anybody, for instance, many of the initial Syrian refugees who, when they went to Lebanon and went to places like Shatila camp, were shocked by the conditions in Shatila camp and went home, tried to go back, and have now tried to return and are being impeded from returning into Lebanon by the Lebanese authorities. This should not be a shock to anybody. Anybody who has spent time in Lebanon, who has interacted with the Lebanese authorities and the way they treat Palestinians, this should not be a shock to anybody. Should Palestinians be asked what they want? Absolutely. Right? Will that happen? Unlikely. The other thing I want to point out is in the drumbeats for war that we're beating for a U.S. attack on Syria occurred at a time when the UNHCR campaign for the Syrian refugees had yet to meet even the 30% mark of fulfillment. And when you think about the amount of money that was going to be spent on this limited surgical strike, as we were told, right, and how much that costs per hour per day, how much of that would have funded the UNHCR campaign for Syrian refugees, right? But that has completely been pushed off the side of the pages ever since the strike is gone, and Obama is no longer going to hit Syria, and the chemical weapons are being dismantled. There is no more discussion of Syria or Syrian refugees in the press. So, one, I think this is obviously part, as Manal said, part of a broader issue related to Palestinian refugees, and one which, of course, and let's also be clear, and I want to make this point very clear. This issue of the refugees, as part of the ongoing peace process, which was talked about a lot this morning by Dr. Kwan and by Ali Obanima, one of the key things is this. The PLO and the Palestinian negotiating authorities, I called them earlier, made a very deliberate policy, which was the issue of refugees, the right of return, was pushed to the side, and this was a negotiating point. It was something they negotiated over. So no longer was the right of return the standard position of the negotiators. It was, in fact, we're going to trade. We're going to trade. And in fact, even at Camp David in 2000, the negotiations had failed. At one point, when Arafat realized that there was not going to be a deal, He told Nabil Shah, put away your file. We're going to negotiate basically the amount of the Refugee Compensation Fund, which at one point was estimated at $50 billion, versus the number that will be allowed to return. And what the Israelis were demanding, that those who were allowed to return were only going to be the elderly. So basically, you could return and you could die. But we're not going to allow the young to come in. We're not going to allow them to reproduce. And any young who do come in will only be allowed in for maybe a few years. That's your right of return. Your right of return is a round-trip ticket. Come in, go back. Okay? Now, I want to add this. And I'm sure you're going to ask a question about the peace process. And I want to build on this morning's panel. Does anybody really believe, considering the fights that have gone on in the Congress over health care legislation, et cetera, does anybody believe that the United States will underwrite a $50 billion campaign to reimburse compensation to the Palestinian refugees? Those days are gone. The chance that that could have happened in 1999 or 2000 is now gone. That's not going to happen. Secondly, does anybody trust Nabil Shah or anybody in the Palestinian Negotiating Authority with a $50 billion fund?
Haram. Okay, we'll shift now to the American role. Secretary Kerry has stated his commitment to a peace process. At the same time, he's leading a U.S. delegation in negotiations with Iran and a dialogue with the Russians on Syria. How high on the priority list can Palestine be? Is there any reason to believe, given all the challenges in the region, the U.S. will aggressively pursue and any step to find a solution before the end of the Obama administration? Manal?
Okay, I'm answering all the questions first. What's important about this point is that we do see a disconnect actually between the priorities of Obama and Kerry, which is quite interesting, because from last spring, or more so in the summer, Obama has in many ways kind of retrenched his foreign policy in the region and decided to be less involved in terms of less democracy promotion, no involvement in terms of what's happening with the Civil War, definitely just an overall restricting U.S. interests or involvement in the region to very carefully chosen issues. That is different than what we see in terms of Kerry's agenda. I think he is sincere. There's no doubt he's sincere. Otherwise, he wouldn't be investing this type of energy. That doesn't mean he's going to get very far, because fundamentally, what the peace process is going to take, if there's going to be any movement on that front, is a fundamental shift in Israel. And a willingness to even move forward in that sense. And I don't think Israel's prepared for that.
Let me just make one point. Interestingly, the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, and I guess if they resume, they're stopped now, are supposed to end next April.
Or March, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also, the Iran European and American negotiations also are supposed to end that month. Do you think the Obama administration will hit a jackpot this week? This one in April?
No, definitely not. And I think they know that they're not going to.
What do you think, Osamah?
Yeah, I want to pick up on Manal's point, which I think is a good one. You know, at this morning's panel on the peace process, one of the things that was discussed was possibilities for American pressure and the relation to Iran. And I wrote a brief for Shabaka about 2 years ago, really unpacking this myth of American pressure and looking at all these different points in history when supposedly the United States was applying pressure to Israel. And underneath what you see is that in each case when the U.S. was pressuring Israel, there was a concession that Israel received, right, which was to the detriment of the Palestinians in each case, right, including the 1991 case that everybody knows of pressure on the settlements. One of the things that was mentioned this morning was the possibility of, again, the U.S. pressuring or the U.S. putting forth a compromise proposal that could be discussed. When you talk to American officials off the record, what they will tell you is the following. We see right-wing Israeli governments in power in Israel for the next decade, okay? And we don't see any political willingness in the U.S. to challenge or pressure real consistent pressure on those right-wing governments. So instead, what we are doing is conflict management. Now, the fear this morning was that that's what was going to happen in the future, was conflict management. Let's be clear. Conflict management, not conflict resolution, has been the standard U.S. policy during the Bush administration and has been continued by the Obama administration. Right? This is not about resolving the conflict. This is now about managing the conflict until, quote unquote, both parties are ready for peace. So what does that mean? What that means is when the Palestinians are willing to provide enough concessions, basically take whatever Israel is willing to offer and agree to it. Right? Now, as Ali mentioned this morning, and I think he's right, Mahmoud Abbas is almost willing to sign on to anything. The problem is there is no offer. There is no firm offer from the other side. And there is no offer that's going to come, right, that any government in Israel is willing to sign on to. Does anybody really believe that there is any kind of agreement that Palestinians could actually sign off on that would pass through an Israeli government? One led by Benjamin Netanyahu or any of his allies? No, it's not going to happen. A great example of this is in 2008. So everybody remembers the big Annapolis push. Supposedly, Ehud Olmert made this great offer to Mahmoud Abbas, right? The second great offer. We had a great offer at Camp David from Ehud Barak, and now we have Olmert's offer. Well, it turns out there was no offer, right? There was a lot of discussion about what an offer could look like. And what's very revealing is that in a recent book published by Elliot Abrams, who was a national security staff member for Bush, who was the back channel between Sharon and Olmert and the Bush administration, came out and literally both he and Bush advised Mahmoud Abbas, don't sign what's offered by Olmert because we don't think his government's going to survive. It won't be worth the paper it's written on. Right? This should be fairly shocking, right? Here they were pushing for peace, and in fact, what they were even willing to discuss, right, was not even a permanent deal. Sign the deal, and we're going to put it on a shelf. It'll be implemented in the future somewhere, right? So we've gone from Oslo, which was supposed to be a 5-year interim agreement that has now lasted 20. Right? To sign an agreement, we'll put it on a shelf, and it'll be implemented sometime in the future when, as Condi Rice used to call it, when the political horizon improves. Right? Whatever that phrase means, right? Think about that piece on the horizon, right? That setting sun, right? So, when we think about what this means vis-a-vis the negotiations over Iran, you can almost guarantee that whatever pressure the U.S. applies to Israel on Iran to sign off on this deal or to kind of nod and approve this deal, right, there will be a concession vis-a-vis the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, particularly if the goal is conflict management, not conflict resolution. And there is no reason to believe that conflict resolution is what John Kerry is planning or what they will implement in the near future.
But, last week, there was a letter from President Obama sent to the American Task Force in Palestine. He repeated the same positions he declared a while ago on illegitimate expansion, religion, on that the borders should be along the 67 lines, and all his traditional positions.
Legitimate expansion of?
The settlements,
Okay.
in other words. And settlements are illegitimate, illegal. It seems the U.S. is still harping on this point. And we have to understand to see how they can make advantage of this. I was surprised that this letter was not published anywhere in the American press. And this is something that I hope the Palestine Center will hold a conference very shortly on the media, how the American media treats with the issues of the Middle East. The three of us can participate again in that and more. So how do you explain that they are still repeating that, probably just for the record? Maybe they're not doing anything about it, that they are still sticking to the same points that they have published at the term by Obama when he came to office.
Right. Well, I think what should be clear to everybody is that there is a public rhetoric, okay, and private action, right? Not everything that the administration says publicly is acted upon privately. Not everything that, and it's not just this administration, but any administration. And we know that particularly in the Middle East, right? So, for instance, the coup in Egypt, right? What was the involvement of the Obama administration in the coup in Egypt? I don't think there's anybody in the room who believes that the Egyptian military would do anything without at least some kind of nod from Washington.
Yeah.
At the same time, the Obama administration offered mixed signals. On the one hand, you had John Kerry saying they were restoring democracy. He went to Cairo recently and said they're still on the path to restoring democracy. Okay? You had President Obama, who has kind of, grumbled. He hasn't come out and objected to the coup openly, but they, in fact, won't even call it a coup and have decided that we don't have to make that determination, right? So there's a big difference between public rhetoric, particularly when it's aimed at the American public, right, and private action. There's a big difference between, an open engagement in Syria and what they are leaking to, for instance, the Washington Post or New York Times, that the CIA is running covert ops and covert training at bases in Jordan, right? And the Saudis are in an open alliance with them. And the Saudis, in fact, are now, we're told in an article in the Washington Post, the Saudis are actually trying to put pressure on the United States to allow for anti-tank weapons and anti-aircraft weapons to be distributed to some of the rebels that they are training. Right? So there's a big difference between public rhetoric and private action.
Well, I think it's become, it is up to us to expose this position publicly somehow. I hope Arab American academicians can do that in the media. That's a suggestion. Let me just proceed ahead. It seems that U.S.-Iranian relations are showing signs of improvement, as we saw this week. There are reports that some Gulf states are increasingly seeing common security interests with Israel, which is alarming. How will this evolving relationship affect Palestine and the struggle for Palestinian rights?
You go for it.
No, okay.
We'll trade off.
We'll trade off.
Well, this isn't new, obviously.
I think you could keep it here.
But it doesn't work. This is new. This is not new, right? And in fact, again, some of this gets back to, if you think about, we had in the panel earlier on sectarianism, this discussion of the role of the Gulf states, the role of the Muslim Brotherhood and the U.S. supporting the Muslim Brotherhood during the Cold War as a counterbalance to Nasserism, right? So members of the Muslim Brotherhood, some fled to Saudi Arabia, some were brought to the United States. This is not new, right? The Eisenhower Doctrine itself in the 1950s, right, was all about containing Jamal Abdel Nasser's popularity and influence in the region. And part of that was about looking for conservative allies in the region who would be a bulwark. We see it again with the rise of the creation of the GCC, right, the Gulf Cooperation Council in the early 1980s. So the Gulf Cooperation Council emerges, right, after the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This is all about building up this quote-unquote bulwark against both Iranian and Soviet influence. But really what it is a chance for the United States to sell massive quantities of weapons to rich Gulf nations where they can be based. And in an article I wrote recently, and Toby Jones, who's here, who'll be in the next panel, will talk more about it. He focuses on the Gulf. Can also talk about this. This is not new, right? What is becoming more apparent is because of the fear of these rich Gulf Arab nations, fear of their own Shia minorities, and fear of Iran's influence, are now being more open about the way that they oppress those minorities, or in the case of Bahrain, their majority, right? And these open alliances with Israel. And some of this, again, can be traced back to the Oslo Accords, which made it okay to now do business with Israel, right? So Qatar has relations with Israel. The UAE has relations with Israel. This is not, right, this should not be shocking to anyone. At the same time, it should also not be shocking to anyone that Palestinians have played on this. So the very notorious Mohammed Dahlan, right, the strong man of Gaza, is now one of the key advisors in the UAE and has his own business where he's now a security consultant. You can imagine what kind of security he's consulting with, right? So again, this is not, and it should not be a mystery to anyone who's following it. It should not be a shock. There are, and there have been, if you look at the Saudi role in the Middle East, right, they will do much like they did with Nasser. They will do a very public face, right, of kind of embracing Nasser and privately working with the U.S. and other forces to undermine him. And they're doing the same exact thing today.
Manal, do you want to add something to this?
I'm fine with it.
Fine. Okay. At present, relationships with Egypt's General Sisi, the new powerhouse in Cairo, and the Gulf states were quick to provide financial support to the Egyptian government, and provided they keep the Muslim Brotherhood at bay. But despite these pledges over the years, support for the Palestinian Authority, itself an opponent of Hamas, Gulf financial support has been lacking. Why do you think that is? And is it likely to change now that there is increased pressure on Hamas? Before you answer, Manal, I will want to tell you I got one more question, and then we're going to open the floor for your questions.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Manal.
In particular, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and United Arab Emirates have now come to Sisi's rescue. And I think their latest contribution was $12 billion, something in the area of $12 billion, which is quite generous. But before that, they were receiving some money. They received a good substantial amount also from Qatar under Morsi. As for the Palestinians, it's important to keep in mind that despite what Osamah did mention, Saudi Arabia has provided quite a bit, and other Gulf states too, in terms of budget support. In the early years after Oslo, it was usually up, in the area of $200 to $300 million a year. And even now, with a very tense relationship, it's about in the area of $100 million a year. So they do provide some budget support, but it's nothing compared to what they are giving elsewhere. Most recently, they very begrudgingly gave $12 million compared to their billions to Egypt, $12 billion to UNRWA. Keeping that in mind, the answer is pretty obvious. Saudi Arabia, Palestine, whether it's the PA or Hamas, is not in any way, shape, or form a priority for Saudi Arabia. So we're not going to see any increase in assistance there. And their interests right now are not aligned with them. What happens in Egypt is much more important for Kuwait or for Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates than what happens in the West Bank or Gaza.
What about Osamah?
Yeah, I would add the following. And Manal's right to point out that in many cases the Gulf states did deliver funds to the Palestinian Authority. In a lot of cases, particularly over the past decade and a half, the amounts that were actually delivered were far less than was pledged. And so even if you think about that $12 million, this is a joke, right?
Peanuts.
This is nothing. This is barely the amount that the Saudi princes spend in London on a weekend, right? it's not even there, right? Right, when we think about the role, part of this is about exhaustion, okay? They're exhausted by kind of continuing to support the Palestinian Authority, continuing to fund money into the Palestinian Authority, and really effectively underwriting the occupation. And we have to be really honest about that. That what the EU is doing, what the United States is doing, and what the Palestinian Authority itself does is creates this facade, right, for the occupation. So the facade that there are two states, and that there are two governments, that there are two presidents, right, or two prime ministers even, right? This facade, that there are two states at war with each other, that this is a conflict rather than an occupation and settler colonialism, right? And in particular, when you look at Jerusalem. So there's been a lot of difficulty. I know a number of the Palestinian NGOs that operate in Jerusalem have been attempting to raise money around trying to save parts of Jerusalem and are finding very little response for this in the Gulf. And why? Because they believe that either the PA has already sold out on Jerusalem, or that the United States is not going to put any consistent pressure, right, to save what's left of Jerusalem, right? So there's a lot of exhaustion I think that they have, but there's also part of their broader geostrategic thinking. But when you look at the amounts that are actually delivered, as Manal's point, and you think about the vast wealth that comes into these states, it's pretty staggering. It's quite a joke. It's quite a joke, particularly if you think about the difference between pledges and what's actually delivered.
You say the Palestinians are giving up Jerusalem. Do you really mean that? How do you do that? How could they do that?
I don't think when you look at the negotiations and when you look at how this has played out, It's very difficult to believe, right? And it's very difficult to believe that this negotiating team is going to be able to achieve very much of anything. When you look at the Palestine Papers, and I know Manal and I were talking about this on the side, when you look at not just the Palestine Papers, which are very consistent with other leaked documents, with interviews with the negotiators, when you look at what they were debating over, where they were coming down on the percentages, all this is a very consistent pattern. If they're willing to give up on the right of return. Right?
You know, I've read recently in the press here that the American Jewish community, at least 1/5 of it, has given up the question of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Is that a sign of a positive sign that we should applaud?
They've given up in what sense?
Given that they no longer want to be involved in this, take care of it, and they just has abandoned it. There's an article in Mondoise, I think it was.
I mean, I would be interested in seeing this article, but I think apathy is
It's the young generation, really. I was talking about the young generation.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, now, strangely, this week, PBS, Huffington Post, I forgot which another newspaper, have been critical of Israel, its policy in the negotiations this week, and the pressure that they are trying to pressure the Congress on the question of Iran and the Israeli lobby. There's a change in the American Jewish community here.
Perhaps, but I think what matters in the end of the day really is change in Israel. And we're not going to see that. We don't see that right now, and we're probably not going to see it in the foreseeable future. That's,
yeah. I mean, I would add to that to say that I think also what really matters is on the Palestinian side, right? And it's really important, I think, that Palestinians begin to recognize that they need to revisit what their national movement looks like in the 21st century. What does it mean to have a national movement in the 21st century? And what does it mean if we are correct, if we think about this morning's panel? And you can hear the pessimism between Manal and I about the negotiations. If there is no two-state solution, what does that mean for the Palestinian national movement? If there will be no Palestine, right? Is this a move? Should there be, and how do we rethink and how do we re-strategize where we go next? So we can sit back and wonder whether these polls about the American Jewish community, if they still have an alliance towards Israel. Palestinians have to take care of their house first. We have enough issues on the table that we need to resolve, including how do you develop a formidable strategy for the future? Right? And that includes being really honest about our past. Very honest about our past, about the PLO, what its role was, what its failings were, its many, many failings, the failings of its leadership, some of which are still in power today, are the same guys who were there in the 70s. So these are very important questions I think Palestinians have to begin asking themselves. One of the things we've tried to do at Shabaka is not only create a space for Palestinians to discuss and debate these things, but to offer alternative strategies. And so I would recommend, if you haven't been to the website before, it's www.al-shabaka.org. We have a number of policy briefs, including this discussion of the PLO, its history, its future. Those are the kind of things I think that Palestinians need to be asking themselves, particularly when these negotiations fail. It's not if these negotiations fail, when these negotiations fail. And when you have a Palestinian Authority that continues to stay in power, right, in part because it's serving other means rather than actually representing its people.
Just to add to that, I agree with Osamah, but I think one of the main issues also, and Osamah, you're going to disagree with me, is even the space for debate is limited. The space for debate is when people agree. But when there's serious disagreements, those spaces become, and I'm talking among the Palestinians, become very confined, number one. Number two, you can't have people talking in the U.S. and Palestinian activists talking in the U.S. and the strategies or whatever tactics they're discussing are completely disconnected from what's happening in Palestinian territories. And that's what we have right now, is this disconnection.
Well, yes and no.
It's a serious problem.
But can I
I
think this
I
is
was going to
important.
say,
I
but the
agree.
internet is very
Right.
important.
But I think this is important, right? So one of the things about Shabak is we try and connect Palestinians everywhere, right? And that includes the number of our policy advisors and policy members, which is ever growing, has more policy advisors and members from outside North America than inside North America, right? We publish everything in Arabic and English, right? Because we want to appeal. And our second largest audience, no other website can claim this, our second largest audience is in Palestine, okay? Nobody else can claim this, right? So we publish everything in Arabic and English, and we actively pursue Palestinians who are in Palestine, historic Palestine, right, for them to participate, and in the diaspora, because we want that discussion to be going. Yes, we may disagree, right? And of course there's going to be disagreement. But let's not pretend that this is new, right? If you think about the history of the PLO.
I think we need to see more disagreement.
That's fine, I agree. But and we should, right? If you think about the history of the PLO, and this is not new, right? So Fatah were the moderates and actively promoted themselves as the moderates, right? And you had a rejectionist camp, right? And this was open. And they used to trade these very nasty bayans back and forth, each one accusing the other of terrible things, right? This was common in the 70s, right? That didn't mean that they were united. But this disagreement's not new. Now you have the same, a similar dynamic, not the same dynamic, right, between Fatah, again the moderates, and Hamas, who are extremists, terrorists, etc., right? And of course the Palestinian left is gone. Doesn't exist anymore, right? It's what's left of it is on some college campuses, and then a very small percentage, you find more of them kind of in the diaspora than you do actually in, say, in the Daffa or Gaza, right?
So what course do you recommend now? What the next step? If that's the case.
First, this is where we might also disagree. In terms of wanting to transform the overall strategy, which sometimes is beyond our control, I think it's very important also to recognize the immediate crises we're dealing with. And I'm not saying to ignore the overall picture. But we have a situation right now where there's confirmation of a political assassination of a national leader. Now, love Arafat, hate Arafat. I haven't heard any calls for an international investigation yet. Gaza is suffocating in terms of was it Ali in the morning was saying that they're drowning in sewage. There's nothing concretely done to deal with the blockade on Gaza. In terms of the closures in the Palestinian territories, 10 years ago we would have never imagined that if you're in Ramallah you cannot get to Jerusalem. It's easier to get to Amman than it is to get to Jerusalem. The economy is basically strangled. The loss because of closures, the economic loss is about $3.4 billion a year. That's a third of Palestinian GDP. So there's no discussion of even development. It's basically survival. So we have all these crises going on, and then when people want to organize the next step, it's like, okay, how do we look at the overall picture? Or no, let's basically discuss one state, two state solutions. When that's not, that big picture is beyond our hands, but we have these immediate crises that need to be addressed. And as I don't know if any of you seen the latest petition circulating, which received at least 3,000 signatures. I know you think it's funny, but I think it's a sign of the magnitude of the crisis we're dealing with, is requesting that Great Britain rescind the Balfour Declaration. There's a serious problem here that needs to be addressed. And anyway.
Yeah, no, I want to, and I don't think it's funny. Right?
I'm just
no, it's okay. I should say, Manal and I have known each other for a long time, and she knows how much, you can tell how much we like and respect each other. So it's...
we agree more than we disagree.
How much?
Manal and I, and we're from neighboring villages in Palestine, so that's even, it adds to it. So, the other thing I want to throw out is that we have been living with these short-term crises for a long time as Palestinians, right? So you want to work on two tracks, right? So one is, how do you resolve those short-term crises but not look away from the longer-term goal? And so part of that is beginning that discussion among Palestinians, right? Also recognizing what some of the huge limitations are. As long as you have a leadership, right, which is not beholden to its people but to itself. And I think this has to be clear. This morning there was a discussion about the peace process benefiting the United States and Israel. The peace process has also benefited the leadership of the Palestinian Authority, and in particular Fatah. Right? So, and I want to be clear about this. And they admit it. This dates back to the 1970s. So, for instance, if any of you have insomnia, I'm not a physician, I'm a PhD. If any of you have insomnia, I recommend you read Mahmoud Abbas's book and Ahmed Koreya's books. Right? Those books will put you to sleep in a second, but they have important information. Right? But they have important information, one of which is the way the Fatah leadership, right, used its position and its majority power within the PLO to push forward its plan, right, of quote-unquote moderation. but that was deliberately stressed to the United States throughout the 1970s and 1980s. And Bill Kwan, who was here this morning, knows this because he was in the National Security Council when these recommendations were being sent, right? And so part of that was, we are moderates, we will cut a deal, we will work with you, and we will accept two states. And we will even accept a truncated state, okay? At one point in 1976, Arafat sends a message through the UN that if Israel only withdraws from just a few kilometers on Gaza, we will recognize a state there. And
But that was not only Fatah's position.
No,
even the radical left.
No. It did not. No. Remember,
It wasn't only Fatah.
Remember, there was a separation. The deal was this, because the PFLP leaves. The PFL leaves the PNC.
And what about in 1988?
I'm getting to that. But the PFLP says, right, any entity that recognizes Israel is not one we will be a party of.
What year?
Right. This is in the 10-point plan of the PNC. If you look at the 10-point plan of the PNC, right, it is, yes, we will.
What happened in 1988?
Let me.
Okay.
Okay. We will set up a Palestinian Authority on any liberated land, but we will not recognize an entity for any Palestinian authority that recognizes Israel, right? So what the Fatah leadership did, so there's a great moment, for instance. So the PFLP does not agree with, the Rejectionist Front does not agree with what Fatah is doing, and they leave. Fatah tries to bring them back in 77. There's this great moment where they're preparing for the PNC meeting, and the PFLP is demanding that no negotiations, right? No negotiations are part of the agreed plank. And the Fatah members tell them, you have a better chance of reaching the moon than you do of getting that in the plank. Okay? So that's 1977.
Okay.
By 1988, it's also clear that the PFLP is weakened, right?
Like everyone else is, yeah.
Like everyone else is, but Fatah's not, right? Remember, 1988 is very different. Cold War is almost over. It's going to be over in just a few months, right? And so yes,
they didn't know that, but
well, of course they didn't know.
Okay.
But don't forget that the funding is already drying up, right? Okay. PFLP has had constant issues with funding. The Rejectionist Front is not in 1988 is not what it was in say 1977. Okay. Even then, it wasn't that strong, right? They agree to two states, right? But that's a majority decision. That is a majority decision. And remember, the PFLP is always going to have a list of reservations on all of these decisions, right? More to the point, the reason why I'm bringing this up. Let's be clear who has dominated the Palestinian Authority since Oslo Accords in 1993. Let's be clear who has benefited from it. You know, and this morning there was a question about whether or not they're treasonous. Ahmed Correa, it is known, has sold cement to the wall and the settlements. And he is still a key decision maker in Fatah.
Yeah.
Okay? So you want an investigation of who killed Abu Ammar. I want an investigation of Ahmed Correa and all of his shady business deals. I want an investigation of Mohammed Dahlan and all of his shady business deals. I want an investigation of every single member of the Palestinian Authority leadership and all of their shady business deals and the oligarchs they are tied to. So eventually, someday, we will get to who killed Abu Ammar, although it's pretty clear, right? But in the meantime, as you know, and you and I discussed, when are we going to actually have an investigation about who killed the Goldstone Report, right? Okay. Who leaked the Palestine Report? All these investigations that Abu Mazen was supposed to launch, and of course, lead right back to him, right? So who's investigating the investigators? Right?
Can we I want to ask one last question, and then we're going to go to the questions from the audience. What if Iran and the West makes a deal? How will that affect us? Many people think, including some of the speakers earlier today, that will be a great plus for the Palestinian cause. Do you guys agree, Manal?
Honest, I have to think about it more, but I don't think it makes a big difference in long term.
I mean, as I mentioned before, whatever that deal is, you can guarantee that in order to get Israeli acceptance, it's going to be bad for the Palestinians. Right? There's going to be a concession on the West Bank and likely on Gaza. But I want to add this as well. Let's be clear. If in going forward, you know, Fatah and Hamas are organic to the Palestinian body politic. Right? Both parties need to reform themselves. There is very little chance Fatah is going to reform itself, particularly if it thinks it's going to win against Hamas. Right? You know, you have these two locked in this struggle in which neither side is willing to compromise. And every time we think they've been negotiating, think about this. They've been negotiating since roughly 2006, 2007 on a unity agreement, right? It's
But
now.
that
It's,
also, it's not only, the problems are not only between them, it's because external actors won't let them have a unity agreement.
how
That's
did we
where
how did we
we're at.
start
Okay,
this about
yes.
about who's reliant? Right. So, but
One
let
minute, 1 minute.
Yeah, let me finish this point. The Oslo Accords were supposed to be 5 years. They went on for 20. If Palestinians who've been negotiating between sides for 7 years cannot agree to negotiate on a unity government, what chance is there for a broader peace? So we have a number of things that we have to get to first internally,
Well,
right?
okay.
We can think about the broader geopolitical issue with Iran and its implications on the Palestinian national movement. But let me be clear. These movements will not reform themselves on their own without significant pressure from Palestinians both in Palestine and in the diaspora. Anybody who thinks that Fatah for some reason is just going to wake up one morning and reform itself is dreaming.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very interesting and illuminating discussion. Both of the speakers said that they are pessimistic in the short term, but more optimistic in the longer term. Dr. Khalil said that he's pessimistic for the next 10 years, next decade. Now, I heard you say that, but now what will be different after that period that will make you more optimistic about a resolution?
Okay.
Well, as I mentioned, in the short term, I think we still have a leadership in the Palestinian Authority, right, that of course is not representative and is not beholden to its people. My hope is, and that in the longer term, what we're seeing is that Palestinians in the diaspora and inside Palestine will begin to start strategizing and thinking about what it means to have a national liberation movement, right, without a two-state solution. What does the future look like? How do we get there? So I'm pessimistic in the short term because I think we're still going to be stuck with an occupation and a Palestinian negotiating authority and its leadership, which is beholden to the U.S. and Israel. I'm more optimistic about the future, particularly among Palestinian youth, especially, both of us are in university settings. We interact with Palestinian youth. We interact with American Jews who are very, have a different idea of what the future may look like, okay? Especially among the youth, and are less beholden to kind of this idea of ethnic nationalism and and knee-jerk kind of support of the occupation. So I think I'm, as an educator, I am very optimistic about the future. But I think we have a lot of steps to get to, and it's not going to be easy.
Okay. The lady here.
Yes, I agree. I'm fine.
Okay,
I have a small question about your last topic, which was the possibilities of leadership and of honest leadership. I believe that one of the speakers this morning, in speaking about the PA, said that there was an elected body there, which had been, well, I don't know. Can you explain about that elected body, which was kicked out or which is not being identified, which has been superseded by the PA? And what about them? What can you tell us about that?
No, the elections were, Hamas won the majority of legislative, can you hear me? Hamas won the majority of seats in the legislative elections of 2006. They weren't allowed to basically to control the legislator. And this wasn't only because of Fatah, but it was also because of international pressure, because Hamas would not comply with the conditions that were put on them. Okay. Yes, Hamas, and that's why Hamas disagreed and took over Gaza and decided to set up their own authority, if that's what you want to call it. But where we're at today is in terms of even who was elected in the West Bank, their terms have run out. So as of right now, everyone's terms have run out. So you don't have anyone who's a legitimate representative.
Ran out a long time.
Okay, in terms of who's supposed to be an elected representative. But I want to be very careful, or I guess I want to open up another discussion because we keep alluding to this point about dismantling the PA. And this point is thrown out like it's such a simple process. And I just want to remind everyone that hate the PA, hate Fatah, whatever your grievances are, the PA in the West Bank alone employs 77,000 people. Okay, that's 77,000, and I'm not talking about those who run the ministries and those who are doing so well and benefiting from Oslo and the occupation. I'm talking about the school teachers. I'm talking about the people who who work in the municipalities. Multiply that by 4, and as we know, very few Palestinian families are made up of 4 people.
Yeah.
But we're talking about 300,000 people who will be immediately affected, okay, in terms of not having income if the PA is dismantled. That's not to mention not having children be able to go to school. That's not mentioning not being able to collect garbage. So before we throw around these very simplistic solutions, we need to really think about the implications of these suggestions.
Right. The only thing I would add is this.
Okay,
and
just,
but I want to add to this point.
All right, yes.
So one of the things that, and Manal's right, that it's not enough to just say we have to dismantle the Palestinian Authority. But let's be clear that during the occupation, the 20 years of the occupation, right, there was a civilian authority which employed Palestinians, right, especially at the mid-level and down. They were all Palestinian employees, right. The idea of dismantling the PA is very simple, right, which is Palestinians should not be responsible for governing the occupation, right. You want Israel to bear the cost of its occupation. The European Union, the United States, their taxpayers should not be funding the occupation and sanitizing the occupation by creating this false notion that there are 2 governments, or, as your friends down the street like to claim, that there is institution building going on in Palestine.
Who are
right?
they? Who are they?
You know who they are. You mentioned them already. Right? That there is institution building going on, and this myth of Fayyadism, right? Salam Fayyad, who has drifted away from the scene back to Texas, right? So let's be clear. This dream of Fayyadism and this dream of institution building, when you look at the actual World Bank reports, show you that the economy in the West Bank, shockingly, this is shocking, right? Gaza has been under siege, and it has a stronger economy than the West Bank. Okay?
Really?
Yes. Why? Because the West Bank's economy is all based on donors, right? You take away those donors, there is no economy, all right? And it's all a self-fulfilling economy. So basically what you're doing is you are pumping in money that then goes to feed these NGO networks, all of which have created an environment and a culture of dependency, not of development. Let's be clear about that. And it's time, when we think about what was going on in the West Bank before Oslo, right? It's not like Palestinians were not employed. It's not like they didn't have jobs within the civilian administration. They did, right? And in fact, as has been documented very well, Sarah Roy's work, Sarah Roy at Harvard, has shown, when you compared the level of funding that went into the West Bank and Gaza and compared it to Israel in general or towards the settlements, very deep disparity between the two, and an active policy of what's called de-development. In other words, no industries. You want to force Palestinians to go work inside Israel. Of course, that dynamic has changed. But when we talk about dismantling the PA, it's that Palestinians should no longer be a party to their own occupation.
No, in principle, it's an excellent suggestion.
Next
But what do
speaker.
what do you do?
Just a second, just a second.
Thank you. Peter Shutley, retired. My question is about Hamas and what their real, deep down inside opinions really are. Israel keeps saying that they're under threat because of Hamas's extremism, but I could see Hamas saying in the end of some negotiations in the future, we'll recognize Israel. That's our only big card. So what do they really believe?
Well, I think one of the things about Hamas that has to be clear, and this is, they have managed in a very short time to replicate every negative aspect of Fatah's rule in the Daffa in the West Bank they brought to Gaza with an overlying more conservative religious policies, right? So the repressive actions of Fatah, they have done that to the T. Summary executions, torture of political opponents, very little political freedom, they've got that down, right? So when we talk about, for instance, the 2006 elections, and these what I've called two competing truncheon authorities, right? Neither one of which wants to have open political expression, open activity, other than those that are allied with them. Hamas has made it very clear. Not only are they willing to cut a deal, what they call the long-term hudna, right? They've already cut deals with Israel. So, for instance, we know last year, and this is the anniversary of the attack on Gaza last year, and then there's, of course, the 2008 anniversary. that there have been tacit agreements, ceasefire agreements, with Hamas, negotiated by third parties, largely Egypt, right? You keep the borders quiet, and we don't mind you ruling Gaza, okay? Especially because it keeps the broader Palestinian national movement weak, and it keeps this Fatah-Hamas split going. I want to make it clear also, right? So, there's been this move to somehow reinvigorate the PLO and bring Hamas into the PLO. And as I've made clear in a policy brief I did for Shabaka, you are not going to get democracy and representation from non-democratic movements. It's not going to happen. So neither Fatah nor Hamas are really interested in democracy or representation. What they're interested in is power. Hamas has demonstrated that, and Fatah has demonstrated it for 40 years.
But Osamah, which
Yeah.
political faction was
Next
ever interested
question.
in democracy?
No, I agree with you. I agree with you. But that's part of us. Don't think that I'm sitting back and
No,
saying,
I'm
oh
just
no, there
saying,
was this.
I'm just-
No, I
Okay.
think we have to be honest about that. We have to be honest about our
Osamah.
past. Yeah.
Some people ask questions.
Okay. Thank you for recognizing this side of the room.
Please, your name.
My
Your
name is Ann O'Leary. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer
Uh-huh.
from the left coast. Anyway, in talk about elections, I just want to propose something that probably is also relevant to the upcoming panel, but I would like your take on this. Despite how disappointed, if that's the word we want to use, to be gentle, all of us might be about the Obama administration's efforts to solve the Palestine problem. I am seriously concerned about what lies ahead. I want to propose that we try to shelve disappointment and look at the post-midterm elections opportunity that a second-term Obama administration might provide for one very important reason. Check out the Palestine policies of all the names who are floated for 2016 presidential candidates. Chris Christie, Marco Rubio, of course Hillary Clinton, we all know how she flip-flopped on Palestine, and even Elizabeth Warren, who's a total wimp on Palestine. So, maybe Obama doesn't look that bad after all. Just consider that.
I just, at this moment, whoever is running, I don't see any fundamental
Speak into your
difference.
phone.
What?
Yeah, your
Oh, can you
phone.
hear me? I don't see fundamental differences, and I don't even see fundamental differences with the new, who might become candidates. I'm not sure. Not fundamentally. Obama has been a disappointment on every level in that regard.
Yeah, but he's not running for re-election.
Yeah.
Right, but that also makes it much more difficult that there's going to be, there's been no movement, no real significant movement, right? So in the last 2 years of his lame duck period, and of course with the midterm elections, there's no guarantee that, that's going to change, right? In fact, it could get worse, and in fact, the pressure kicks in even more, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't want to damage your vice president, you don't want to damage Hillary Clinton, you don't want to, right? So basically that lame duck period, the Clinton days are over, this idea that, there's going to be this mad dash for peace, right? Because Clinton wants his legacy and he wants his Nobel Peace Prize. Obama's already got his Nobel Peace Prize, right?
Yeah.
Hey, he got it for not much more than a speech, right?
Yeah.
So forget it. And again, I want to come back to this, that it's not just about what the U.S. administration can do. There is not a government in Israel right now, nor one that is predicted, considering the trends in Israel, that's going to sign off on a deal for a Palestinian state that's going to be worth anything to call a Palestinian state, right? It's not what they want, right? They are very happy with what they have right now, right? They have a neutered Ramallah-based Palestinian Authority run by Fatah, and then they have, quite frankly, a Palestinian Authority in Gaza that is sinking in sewage. And that they believe that they can choke it off until Hamas is finally overturned.
Okay,
Yes.
I have
No, the lady behind you.
Sir,
yes.
excuse me. Excuse me, sir.
I'm sorry.
I was given the microphone after. Is that okay?
It's okay, yes, it's okay.
All right. My name is Chris Ferrero from Seton Hall University. Thank you both. This has been excellent. Identity is a core theme of this conference. And Osamah, I'm glad that you brought up the issue that Palestinians need to talk about what it means to have a national movement going forward. Even beyond that, once a Palestinian state is established, I think this is a core problem that has been insufficiently addressed today. What does it mean to be Palestinian? Thus far, I find that Palestinian identity is largely defined in juxtaposition and in opposition to Israel. And even as you talk about defining a national movement going forward, I think one of the things that needs to be addressed further is what are the civic values associated with Palestinian nationalism? It's not just about ethnicity or those types of descriptive characteristics. For Palestine to succeed in the long term, there needs to be a coherent civic identity. And I was wondering, both as Palestinians, if you could comment on what you think is most popular and what you would like to see develop as that identity.
So, really, you want to? Shukran, thanks. All right, so, look, I think you want to be clear that there's not one single homogenous Palestinian identity, right? And there are very many different Palestinian experiences, right? So, for instance, I mentioned my wife's family, right? So my wife is a Palestinian refugee whose family is originally from Nazareth. She still has family there. She has family in Jordan. She has family in Syria, and she grew up in Lebanon, right? So she has a very different kind of view of being Palestinian than I did, with a family from the West Bank, grew up in New Jersey, and what it means to be Palestinian, right? And Manal as well. Manal has, I don't want to speak for Manal. Manal can speak for herself. But Manal has also her own different Palestinian experience, right? So there is a identity of being Palestinian, but very different experiences. That's no different, by the way, than being American and being from Texas or being from California or being from upstate central New York, right? So when we talk about developing a civic identity, right, part of that had to be done in the diaspora. Part of it was done during the time of the PLO when you had a small para-state initially in Jordan and then in Lebanon. And what does that identity mean? And how has it changed, for instance, in Lebanon? How does your identity change when the PLO is no more and you're still living in Shatila? How does it change in the Shatila camp? How does it change when you're a Palestinian refugee but you don't live in the camps? Right? When you're a Palestinian refugee right now has Lebanese citizenship. Right? So there's not this single homogenous Palestinian identity, even in the West Bank or in Gaza. Right, as someone who spent a lot of time in Gaza, the difference between being a Palestinian in Gaza and being someone who's a refugee versus someone whose family is, traces its roots back to in Gaza for generations, right? Very different experience than someone who, say, grew up in Nablus and whose family's been in Nablus for generations, or Jerusalem. Well, there is no state, right? So there's no, right? Inshallah.
Okay. Next question.
George, I want to answer this gentleman. We Palestinians in the diaspora, we are hoping to make the big difference, because there in the Arab world, as you know more than anybody else, they are collaborating with the occupier from Morocco to Iraq. There's no question.
I really disagree.
I am talking about governments. I'm not talking about people. Number one. Number two, what we want just like any country in the world. We need a state, and we have a state, but we were expelled from it.
We want it back.
We need, just a minute, we need a state, and then we need a government to make the things going, and we need institutions. So that's the question. The question: we don't have a government. The government work for the Zionists, and that's why if I know they work for the Zionists, Abbas and his group, you think Obama will help him? He will not help him. There is nobody who's asking for Palestinian rights. Nobody, and I challenge anybody who can come and say, yes, there are.
Atil, hold on. Here. The last question, here.
Yeah, I would like to say the same question that we asked about Palestinian also applies for the Israelis. You have Israelis coming from Russia, you have Israelis from here and all that. So, being a people, we should not look at the differences and we ignore and say there are no people. Every country has their own differences, and we should respect that differences. We should respect the freedom of people too and their legitimate rights.
Thank you. The last question here, the lady. معك استنى شوي. She's bringing you the microphone.
Another retired Foreign Service officer.
nobody's really addressed the huge number of Palestinian refugees that are sort of on the move and under pressure all over the region. Over 400,000 in Syria, over 400,000 in Lebanon. The Iraqis, the ones who lived in Iraq, they're all under pressure. What do you think you could do? What can the Palestinian community do to help these people? How do they affect what's going on? Do they give any additional sense of immediacy to the problem? And another issue is Jordan. And that is, you now have a huge number of Syrian refugees in Jordan, a huge number of Iraqi refugees in Jordan, plus the older Palestinian refugee community in Jordan. Jordan seems to be our pet. We have been supporting them. They've been our client state for so very long. What is the position of Jordan? What do you see happening with Jordan as all this turmoil goes on?
Okay. You want to take
We actually specifically addressed that question as it pertained to Syria, and it's a
Jordan is different. I mean, because it's more refugees now than it is Jordan.
But it's a huge problem right now, and all countries need to cooperate. But as we specifically address the Palestinian refugees, I mean and again, I don't like just focusing on the Palestinian refugees when you've had 6 million people leave Syria, who are all over. But in terms of the Palestinian refugees, they were put in the very awkward position where they would have to basically give up their right of return if they're coming back to the West Bank. And I do think, although this has not happened, but they should be consulted on what kind of solutions they want, because we don't know if they'll even be allowed to go back the day after to Syria. And they are in harm's way more than other refugees at the moment.
Well, I'm thinking about the security implications more than anything else.
Well, thank you very much. This was a very delightful afternoon. Thank you.